afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. A number of you I recognize, and it's good to see you, even if it isn't in person. And there's a lot of new faces here as well. My name is Donna Steffens. I'm the director for the Time in the Valleys Museum. And for the new faces who don't know much about the museum, we're in the Catskill Park in Sullivan County, New York. We have a super museum with 3 floors of interactive exhibits, as well as a whole outdoor section that's expanding even further, our 1930s Lost Catskill Farm. Right now we're not open. We have a tentative opening date for the 25th of this month, and that is tentative, but we're hopeful. Until that time, go to the website, timeinthevalleymuseum.org. We've got a whole virtual museum section. We also have recorded programs of past programs that we've had, including John Conway in Sullivan County Retrospect, and Ronald Knapp, who did a program on covered bridges. So those are on our website. Everybody should be, and if they're not, if you can do it yourself, mute yourself when the program starts, which is going to start right now. So no external noise is distracting. I also stopped the chat section because that we found very distracting. People complained the last program, it was quite distracting as well. So if you do have questions, and I know you will, I'm sure Mr. Riley will be able to answer them right after the program. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Tom Riley, who is a retired teacher and historian who's going to give the program on New Netherland. Okay, so let's get started.
Thank you, Donna.
Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. I'm down here in northern New Jersey, but we have a similarity in the fact that they were both part of New Netherlands. Okay, so getting started. So really the story of New Netherlands starts in 1609 with Henry Hudson and his ship, the Half Moon. We don't have a photo of Henry Hudson, so we're not sure exactly what he looked like, but what they've come up with. So Hudson was hired, he was an Englishman, and he was hired by the Dutch East India Company. And as we all remember, the Dutch East India Company was looking for a shorter route to their colonies in Asia, especially the Spice Islands, which ended up being Indonesia. So these are their Dutch colonies that they already had established in many different parts. And Dutch being very closely related to the sea, you know, they were some of the first. Portuguese were probably the first to sail to Asia. We know that the Dutch followed them not long after and established the colonies that you see here shortly after the Portuguese. So on this exploration, his plan was to go north. As you can see there, he left Amsterdam in March, and actually he was going to try to find a way across the northern hemisphere, around the top of Europe and Asia to get to, but he ran into, you know, as we would expect, icebergs and other frozen conditions. So he turned around, and by August, he had made his way to off the coast of North Carolina. It's later going to be North Carolina, and made his way north, checked out east coast of what's now the Carolinas and Virginia, and that's when he discovered a large waterway that was heading north. Of course, another incentive was to bring back those spices that everybody wanted in Europe, and there were fortunes to be made in the spice trade. That was one of the main incentives of wanting to go to the west to get to the east. Common Spices that we take for granted today, like pepper and cinnamon and cloves, were in very high demand. Now, perhaps you wondered, like I've wondered, what was the big deal about spices? And of course, we have to remember that there was no refrigeration. So oftentimes, the food that we were eating was not in the best shape and had possibly even started already to decay. So if you could put something on it to make it taste better, that was a major incentive. Not a very good picture, but of course we see that silk was also in high demand. Not for the common man, but rich people were amazed by that beautiful material started coming from. Of course, the spices and the silk were first introduced in Europe as a result of the Crusades. Those crusaders came back with all these wonderful things. The demand in Europe was very high. So that's when they started looking for a shorter way to get there instead of all the way around Africa. Gold, of course, is another incentive. Still is. And Hudson was preceded by a number of other explorers, a whole handful of explorers. We're talking 1609 for Hudson, but we can see that Columbus, of course, had already been to the Caribbean. John Cabot had sailed for England, even though he was an Italian. Cartier had sailed into Canada and down the St. Lawrence River. And Verrazano, for the French, had basically followed the same course along the East Coast that Hudson did. So we're going to have conflicting claims here. So this is the Northwest Passage everybody was looking for. It does exist. And of course, this is northern Canada, and it has been traversed, but it took a few hundred years later because the only way to get through there is with a submarine. And the American submarine Nautilus was one of the first, if not the first, to make that journey through the Northwest Passage. Of course, a lot of times they had to go underneath the ice. Today, icebreakers keep sections of that route open, at least in the summertime. So when we compare Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, to those modern vessels, you can see that they were really very fragile and not that big. You couldn't bounce off very many icebergs with a fragile wooden ship like the Moon. Hudson continued his journey, and he sailed in Hudson's Bay, which of course now has his name. And unfortunately, he was English, but his mostly Dutch crew mutinied. And they set him and his small son and a number of other sailors who wouldn't mutiny drift in a small boat. And that's the last that anybody ever saw of him. So he probably perished 1611. His Dutch crew sailed back to Holland. They were court-martialed and suffered the penalties of mutiny like any other ship. I'm not sure if they were executed. Nothing was ever seen of Henry Hudson or the boat. The map of Europe at this time looks very much different. You can see the Ottoman Empire in the Iberian Peninsula. We can see that German Empire, that's really what is left over of the Holy Roman Empire. And we can see that Italy is not united into a single country. Somewhat different than today. In the midst of this, we find the small country of the Netherlands. My dogs are barking at the dog that they hear. So you can see Netherlands, who was initially controlled by Spain, and Dutch were able to throw off the Spanish and form the Dutch Republic, which is not a big place. Probably only about 2 million inhabitants of the Netherlands at this time. Closer view, some of the names that are familiar to us are the Zuiderzee, Gelderland, perhaps. But if you have any Dutch ancestors and you've done their genealogy, you'll find these names as the origin of where they came from. And the prefix van in front of a name, like my relatives were the Van Westervelds. In German, it's Van. In French, it's D. But those prefixes really refer to the place that they came from. So in Van Westervelds, it means people from Westerland or Westerveld. So that's what the Van stands for. It's Van in German. So, for instance, you might find a family called Vanderfries, and they, of course, would have been people from Friesland. So Hudson was working for the Dutch East India Company, but soon after his explorations, we see the formation of another company, the Dutch West India Company. And these were really companies. These are a business. This is like a corporation would be today. And they were in the business of trade and a lot of other things, as we'll talk about in a minute. So now we have the Dutch West India Company. Their headquarters is still there in Amsterdam. You can visit it. Ever go there? Kind of interesting to think of a building, made in the 1600s, still being used today. And then, of course, everything changed. The native people along the east coast of the United States, especially in the North River, Hudson River area, are going to have their lives changed forever. Europeans. Hudson at first had no problem trading with the Indians. They seemed friendly and were very anxious to trade for, minimal things that were important to them. As he sailed up the Hudson, the North River, he came in contact with a number of different tribes. The Algonquins, the Lenape, inhabited the lower Hudson, and about halfway up, you had the Mohegan, and then finally, by the time you got up to the river that has the same name, you have the Mohawks, who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And beaver pelts, probably a buffalo pelt or a very big beaver. When we talk about the Dutch, that's the main thing they were interested in. Europeans had different incentives for exploring and colonizing, but the Dutch were businessmen. And that's the main thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about Netherlands. The whole purpose of its existence was to establish trade with the Native Americans. It wasn't farming. That'll be the English preoccupation. It was trading. And of course, the beaver was the main source of the pelts. They collected all kinds of pelts. Otter pelts were valuable. They even collected muskrat, but beaver was in high demand. And The reason they wanted the beaver pelts is because it would be processed. Actually, the Russians established this process of scraping the inner hair of the beaver off and making it into felt, compressing it into felt to make felt hats, which were the craze in Europe at this time. So it's the demand for fur felt to be made into hats. That was the incentive. And of course, thousands and thousands of beaver pelts will be shipped out of New Netherlands. In the middle of their occupation, about the 1650s, they were shipping about 50,000 beaver pelts out of New Netherlands. By the end of New Netherlands in 1664, when the British take it over, they were sending about 80,000 pelts back to the Netherlands to be processed. And this is the first way that it changed the life of the Native Americans. Every possible animal that the Native Americans could collect, they could transform into things that they needed, like steel or iron, and it was in great demand. It wasn't before long that many areas were completely trapped out of fur-bearing animals. For a long time, the Native Americans thought that the Anglos were a race of people that didn't have any women, because every person that they came in contact was a male. And they wondered what kind of strange people these were. So it's one thing to draw a map. This is the map at its greatest extent that the Dutch claimed. See, it extends all the way from Delaware Bay in the south, including, Massachusetts and Cape Cod, which is, later going to be the English colony, and all the way north into areas that'll be claimed by. But it's one thing to draw a map and say you claim it. Really, you had to occupy it. You had to have people there in order to control. So the Dutch West India Company, like the East India Company, set up a number of trading posts around the Atlantic, just like the East India Company had done in Asia. The Dutch West India Company is doing the same thing in Africa and South America. You can see that New Holland, which are going to be the Dutch colonies in Brazil. And Redcliffe, you see in the south there, that is where my ancestors, the Romains, went to. They went with Prince Nassau, who was a nobleman who set up that colony. When we think of Dutch colonies, you got to think small. They had a somewhat unique method of setting up these trading posts. They call them factories. And a factory would consist of a relatively small number of people. Traders, of course, merchants were the most important. But other groups of people were sent to these factories in order to support the merchants and the soldiers. So if you can think of, say, Fort Orange, where Albany, New York is today, a handful of soldiers, maybe as many as a half a dozen or a dozen, a group of traders, a small number of farmers, and people involved in other agricultural occupations that were there to support the traders and the soldiers. So the purpose wasn't to set up a colony and export agricultural products. The purpose was to set up a trading post, defend it with a small number of people, and send support people to help feed them. Called the trading posts counting houses. And of course, They were the most important part of any Dutch factory. The Dutch West India Company, like I said, was actually a company, and they got their start raiding the Spanish. The Dutch and the Spanish had been at war for a number of years, and of course, we know the Spanish are collecting large amounts of gold and other precious objects from their colonies in Peru, from the Incas, and in Mexico from the Aztecs. They're sending these treasure ships, back to Spain, and they were perfect targets for the Dutch West India Company. And the grubstake of the Dutch West India Company was when they captured one of these Spanish galleons and captured approximately $60 million worth of gold. That got the company going. So Dutch privateers working for themselves and sharing their loot with the Dutch West India Company. So it was like a company in the pirate business. Of course, this gold was all melted down into Spanish doubloons, like we see here, pieces of 8. They're called pieces of 8 because they would cut them up, and that's where we get a quarter from. Quarter is 1/4 of a piece of 8. Quarter, it's half, become an eighth. Billions of dollars of gold, some of which the Dutch were able to rip off for the Dutch West India Company. Small ships, but as you can see, it was a very interesting situation. The ships had to be loaded properly, distribute the weight, and of course, the main thing was having cargo space to bring back the pelts from New Netherlands. Typical Dutch trading ship. So when we talk about the settlement of New Netherlands, so we have the explorers that come first, like Hudson, and then the Dutch West India Company establishes these factories, these trading posts. And we all know the story of how the Dutch bought Manhattan Island, 60 guilders, about $24. But long before the establishment of Manhattan and the Netherlands, the Dutch had already settled upstream on the North River, the Hudson River, at the Cascades of the Hudson. So it's navigable about to Albany, where there's a set of rapids, and it's not navigable after that. So also, we have at Albany, we have the Mohawk River coming in from the west. So it was a perfect place for a trading post. Take advantage of the Indians coming down the Mohawk River, coming down north on the Hudson River, and it was their first and main trading post. They established a fort called Fort Nassau. That was about 1614. And then later, we'll see the establishment of Fort Orange. Fort Orange was a Dutch West India Company fort, about in the same place, just outside of what's Albany today. And that was before Manhattan. So Manhattan was a wilderness. And then Peter Minuet was a stockholder in the Dutch West India Company. He's appointed governor of New Netherlands, and he makes the favorites trade, of course, with the wrong people. He was dealing with Munsee Indians, who were Lenape, Manhattan Indians. Peter Minuet is a really interesting guy. He was a ship captain, and he was a Walloon. Walloons are French-speaking people from what is now Belgium. And Walloons made up the 30 families that arrived in New Netherlands in 1614, and they distribute them around in different. They don't even all settle in the same place. Some are settled in Fort Orange, Albany. Some go to the Delaware River and establish a trading post there. Others are sent to the Connecticut River, where they establish a Dutch trading post there. So these were little tiny trading posts distributed throughout, the wilderness areas. And eventually, New Amsterdam in 1626 will be created on Manhattan. Typical of what you would see of construction of one of these Dutch trading posts.
Good morning. Can I call you back? I'm listening to a webinar.
The buildings that they made, of course, we all know about log cabins, but both the English and the Dutch built buildings to live in similar to what they had lived in back in Holland. Thatch roof, little street scene in New Amsterdam. They really did have a windmill like this. These are all scenes from New Amsterdam as it was being developed. Typical Dutch windmill. Notice the gentleman's wearing wooden shoes. And wooden shoes were really like work shoes. You could wear wooden shoes and not have to worry about getting manure on them from the barn or mud on them. They were work shoes. Unfortunately, the gallows. Oh, there's somebody hanging on the gallows. Not a good day for that guy. Later, as New Amsterdam developed, you can see the Dutch flag flying there. They switched from houses made for wood to their favorite building material, bricks. The Dutch build with brick. About 1629, the Dutch came up with a system to try to alleviate their problem of attracting settlers to New Amsterdam. New Netherlands grew very slowly. And the reason for that is, number one, they didn't have that many people back in Holland to begin with. And number two, life was pretty good back in Holland. There was still land to be tilled. They were reclaiming land from the sea. So it was hard to get Dutch to immigrate to New Netherlands. And probably at any given time, only about half of the settlers in New Amsterdam and New Netherlands, only about half of them were actually Dutch. Others came from a long list of other countries, many Germans. We mentioned Walloons, who really were French-speaking Belgian people, Scandinavians. You could find Norwegians and Danes, and even eventually you'll find a group of Jewish people who established the first synagogue in what's later going to be New York. So in 1629, in order to enhance their settlement, they established the patroon system. The patroon system, he is a patroon, by the way. If you could attract 50 people to New Netherlands, you would be given a stretch of land along the Hudson River. And if you could attract 100 people, they would give you about 12 miles along the river. And if you're on the western side of the river, that 12 miles would extend as far to the west as you could claim. There was no western border. If you picked land on both sides of the river, they would give you half that much land. So the patroon ships were established. And eventually, manor at Rensselaerwick, we all know of the town Rensselaer families, famous family, Rensselaer College. Well, that was the only successful patroon ship. All the other ones failed. So really, the patroon system really just didn't work. Killian Rensselaer, who was a diamond merchant back in the Netherlands, he had a successful patroon ship, and he never really came to the New Netherlands, but his relatives ended up controlling this large expanse. It was really like a feudal system, where the people who came there, worked as indentured servants, and everybody worked for the manor, just like in medieval times. The other 4 patroon ships were sold back to the West India. And of course, that's about where Albany. This was outside Albany, outside Fort Arnhem. And Stephen Rensselaer was the last patroon. When the English took over, they recognized the Rensselaer property and their control of it. And it really wasn't until the 1840s that the Rensselaers lost, total control of the area around their patroon ship. So it lasted about 200 years. Large manor house. If you can recognize what's growing there, you see that it's tobacco. And we don't think of tobacco being grown around here anymore. Actually, the Connecticut River Valley does still have some tobacco production. But tobacco was also one of the products that they could export, like Virginia, out of New Netherlands. Actually, the Dutch adapted to tobacco smoking very readily. And when one of the governors tried to ban smoking in public places, they actually had a sit-in outside of his house to protest his, it didn't work. He had to rescind his decree. Dutch West India Company was also in the business of transporting slaves. And the first slaves arrived in New Amsterdam very early, small number, but they became an important part of the labor of the colony. Most slaves in New Netherlands worked for the Dutch West India Company. Slave auction. When we think of slavery, for the typical Dutch settler, it wasn't the plantation slavery that we think of in the southern part of the United States. If you had a farm, you might have 1 or 2 slaves, one to help you with the field, another to help your wife in the house, domestic servant. But it wasn't large plantation slavery. The Dutch West India slaves were, of course, used for manual labor. History of slavery, we see most of them went to Brazil. The thicker the band, the higher the number of slaves. Another large number went to the Caribbean, of course, to the sugar plantations. We don't think of the Danish, but the Danish owned the Virgin Islands. We actually bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark. And then you had the French colony of Guyana in northern South America, which they still control. French Guyana is actually an overseas department of the French government. It's a little piece of France that is still there in northern South America. And then, of course, the Spanish to Mexico and the British to North America. But as you can see, most slaves did not come to North America. So New Netherlands goes through a number of different governors, and unfortunately, this gentleman was one of the worst. He was a dictator, and he was a very anti-Native American governor. And he did everything he could to remove the Native Americans from New Netherlands. And he sponsored a number of attacks against the Native Americans. He sent a large number of soldiers across the Hudson to attack the Hackensack Indians in New Jersey. He also sent another raiding party to kill, basically, massacre, actually, men, women, and children in Long Island. They said when he attacked Bergen in New Jersey that they could hear the screams coming from the Indians all the way to New Amsterdam. It was really genocide. Now, this is genocide on the part of the Dutch against the Native Americans. And one of the incentives for doing this is because the beaver pelts that they depended on Native Americans to bring in to trade had already been eliminated. The beaver became extinct, as most fur-bearing animals in the southern Hudson. So they didn't need the Indians anymore. And they were just a cause of trouble. And that's why Keefe tried to eliminate them, unfortunately. This is one of the first examples of where we don't have to go to Nazi Germany to find a Holocaust, because we had one right here. Of course, the Native Americans retaliated. Eventually, a peace treaty was settled, and they came to an understanding, but relations with the Native Americans would never be the same after this. So this is like the 1642. This gentleman was largely responsible for reaching out to the Native Americans. He had studied Native American languages, lived with Native Americans, and he ended up applying for a patroonship just north of New Amsterdam in what's now going to be Yonkers. And actually, the origin of the word Yonkers for that part of New York comes from Vanderdam. William Keefe was recalled. Now, even his cruelty was too much for the Dutch West India Company. They recalled him, and he died in a shipwreck on the way back to Netherlands. Most famous governor of New Amsterdam, of course, was Peter Stuyvesant. And we all know about Peter Stuyvesant and the stories of his peg leg. He lost the leg fighting on the island of St. Martin when the Dutch were trying to capture St. Martin from the French. And he lost his legs in that battle. And today, if you've ever visited St. Martin, you can see that half of the island is controlled by the French and the other half is controlled by the Dutch. That's how they settle it. They ended the war by dividing the island in half. Unfortunately, Peter Stuyvesant was just as much a dictator as the other Dutch West India governor. Remember, everybody works for the Dutch West India Company. Everybody is an indentured servant, and after your time is up, you even are dependent on the company to sell whatever you're building or making. So it was a monopoly on the entire culture of New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. And that's another reason why people didn't want to come there. You came there was very little social mobility. It was impossible to rise from the working class into the governing class. Peter Stuyvesant treated all of the inhabitants of New Netherlands as a servant, not a citizen. people started rebelling. They presented Stuyvesant with a number of petitions demanding more say in the government, demanding more freedoms. And as you can see here, he just ripped them up. He could care less. Punishment was strict, harsh under Peter Stuyvesant. And even though he's famous, if you read about him, he was really a tyrant. He was a tyrant to the people that lived under him. At this time, Wall Street was built. And, of course, there really was a wall at Wall Street. The city that's there, the street that's there today is the exact place where the original wall, which walled off the northern part of New Amsterdam for protection. Probably a fantasized view of what the wall looked like. Canal Street is another important street in the city of New York, and there really was a canal at Canal Street. The Dutch, of course, were famous for their canals, still are, and New Amsterdam had a number of canals. Can't see it very well, but you're going to see that soon the Dutch are going to have some competition, not just from the English, but if you can see that fuzzy flag back there, it's really the flag of Sweden. And New Sweden is a colony established, by a company. Again, they're using the same type of govern and settlement pattern. The Pilgrims were really working for the Plymouth Company. The Dutch were working for the East and West India Company. So the New Sweden Company was established on the Delaware River in southern New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Small colony. Like the Dutch, they had a hard time attracting settlers. A lot of Finns from Finland ended up going to New Sweden. So at this particular time, what you look at there, the New Netherlands is not that big area that you saw on the original map. The red area there is really what comprised of New Netherlands. Hudson River Valley and eastern Long Island. See the Dutch. Down in the south, you see the New Netherlands that was established. The Swedes established Fort Christina on the Pennsylvania side, and they established another fort at what's going to be Camden, New Jersey, right across from Philadelphia. So they're competitors, and the Dutch don't like it. So they're in constant competition for the furs with the Swedes. And the Swedes, they had a little bit more tolerant attitude towards the Native Americans. And if Native Americans could take his furs to the Dutch in New Amsterdam or the Swedes at Fort Christina, he probably would pick the Swedes because they were less racist. You see, Johan Prince is going to be the governor of New Sweden. Again, small areas, small trading posts were established. The Swedish flag flying there. And back in Europe, we can see Sweden was more than the Sweden that we know today. They controlled a number of areas like Latvia and Estonia and the Baltic states. The whole country of Finland was dominated by Sweden, and Sweden was a major player. Parts of Norway, even parts of Germany were controlled by the Swedes. Today, Sweden is known as a neutral country. They stay neutral in most conflict. This time, they were a major player competing with all the other European countries for a chunk of the New World. It was the Finns who came to New Sweden that brought the log cabin. Log cabins were common in Finland because they were, from the woods. That's another reason the Finns made good settlers, because they were used to a rough way of life living in the forest. And they brought the first log cabins to the New World. Prince, they say, weighed about 300 pounds. Indians called him Big Belly. So Peter Stuyvesant got tired of tolerating the Swedes, and he decides that he is going to conquer the Swedish colony. And he marches an army across New Jersey. Another part of his army sails south, and without firing a shot, like the Dutch, the Swedes did not send very many soldiers there. But New Sweden is forced to surrender to New Netherlands. Now, the Dutch, again, needing settlers, they made very lucrative offers to the Swedes and the Finns that were already there. If they could convince them to stay in the New World, as long as they would swear allegiance to the Dutch, swear allegiance to the Dutch West India Company, the Swedes were welcome to stay. And many of them did. Most of them did. Unfortunately, about in the 1650s, another war breaks out with the Native Americans. And this war is called the Peachtree War. Somebody said that all wars start for the wrong reason. Well, when a Native American girl who had basically been assimilated into the Dutch colony, when she picks a peach off of farmer Hendrik van Dyke's peach tree, he shoots her dead. Within days, hundreds of Native Americans are knocking on the gates of New Amsterdam. So this is called the Peachtree War. About 100 Dutch were captured, held for ransom. About 50 were killed. The Indians swarm across the river into Pavonia, into what's now New Jersey. New Jersey was was depopulated by the Peachtree War. And many, many natives were killed as well. Taking hostages was a common practice. And we have to remember that by this time, the Native Americans had suffered about 7 epidemics that killed hundreds and hundreds, thousands of Native Americans. Kind of interesting in the pandemic that we're experiencing right now. And you can imagine what effect it had. Overall, in all of North America, it's estimated about 95% of the Native Americans were killed by either warfare or epidemic. This is on the East Coast, first contact. Eventually, Stuyvesant was able to sign a peace treaty and ended the war. Typical Dutch house. Bergen was the first town in New Jersey. This, of course, is kind of aimed at the people down here that I give this presentation for. But Bergen Square is still there. These were the first settlements, and that square in the middle, well, that's still there in the middle of the city of Jersey City. That was the first Dutch town in New Jersey. Typical Dutch couple. New Amsterdam was a very cosmopolitan city, town. And the famous quote is that walking down the street in New Amsterdam, a gentleman is reported of hearing 18 different languages on the streets of New Amsterdam because of the trade, because of the number of settlers that came from all over Europe to settle there. And later, it's becoming prosperous. So there wasn't much incentive to come to New Netherlands in the beginning, but once it becomes a prosperous colony, now they're attracting more and more people. And of course, New York City has that reputation of being a cosmopolitan, many different groups of people settling, and also the liberal attitude of the Dutch. The Dutch were liberal when it came to religion. So people like the Walloons, who were Protestant French, Huguenots, who were Protestant French, the Pilgrims. That's why they found a place to stay in the Netherlands, because of their tolerance of religion. And that same tolerance overflowed into the colony of New Amsterdam. Even Catholics, now almost everywhere, from the English, the only place Catholics were accepted was in New France. But in New Sweden, in the Netherlands, in New England, Catholics just were not welcome. When you see Irish listed as a group of people, like there were many Irish in New Amsterdam, they're not Catholic Irish. They're Protestant Irish. Catholics just were not permitted. And in New Netherlands, they wouldn't persecute the Catholics as long as they didn't practice their religion in public. You could be a private Catholic and live in New Amsterdam. 1664 is the next biggest change. English, it's kind of interesting that the Dutch couldn't tolerate the Swedes, so they take them over. Well, if you think of the British, you've got the British in New England, you've got the British in southern colonies, Virginia, you've got the British in the mid-Atlantic colonies like Philadelphia, and right in the middle, like a toothache, is New Netherlands. So just as the Dutch couldn't tolerate the Swedish colony anymore, the English couldn't tolerate the Dutch colony anymore. And the King of England gives Virginia, including all the way to New England, to his brother, the Duke of York. And the Duke of York sends an admiral named, I think his first name was Christopher Nichols. And he sails a fleet of ship with about 200 soldiers into New Amsterdam Harbor and points his cannons at the fort. Stuyvesant, the old soldier that he was, he wants to fight. And he's ready to fight. He's ready to go down shooting against the British. The people of New Amsterdam, however, had a different opinion. Their fort really hadn't been kept up. They had neglected maintaining their fort. Some say it was actually falling down around them. And Stuyvesant, after about a week, agrees to surrender. He marches his army out of New Netherlands, out of New Amsterdam, and surrenders to the British. Later, we're going to see that Stuyvesant returns to the Netherlands. He actually is the scapegoat. The Dutch West India Company blames the takeover by the British on Stuyvesant, and he's disgraced. But he does return to New York. He had a large farm at the Bowery. We have heard that name Bowery before. Well, Bowery really was a farm. And Stuyvesant lived out the rest of his life on his Bowery in New Amsterdam. And he's buried there. He'll be 80 years old, which is old for that time. Interesting individual. So the Dutch flag comes down, and New Netherlands is now part of England. Like the Dutch did with the Swedes, the English give the Dutch very lucrative terms. And they want the Dutch to stay too. They have established businesses. The Dutch run everything. So the English encourage the Dutch to stay, and most do stay. They don't return to Holland. And we know, of course, that Dutch influence is still felt in the Hudson River Valley today. We see that the British offered them citizenship as long as they would swear allegiance to the English king, they could stay. So those trading posts and the fur industry, controlled by the Dutch, now it's controlled by the British. And those furs are going to be going back to England instead of the Netherlands. The English send Arent Schuyler north, makes a treaty with the Indians at Minisink on the Delaware River. And the Schuyler name becomes very important, especially around Albany. So this basically refers to the area where I'm from, the Pumpkin River Valley, settled by the Dutch, Pumpkin Patent. You know, the Dutch and the English had a law that you had to buy the land from the Native Americans before you could buy it from the government. So they had to make deals with all of these people. Typical Dutch architecture, like you see in the Hudson Valley. You know, this is the oldest building of Dutch construction in northern New Jersey. When we look at Dutch houses, we see they always have like two parts to it. And often asked, like, well, what was the original part? The original part was the little part. You know, the small section was the main Dutch house, and the new big section, you know, that's the addition. And most Dutch houses in our area are like that. Today, there is a CVS pharmacy on that same site. So you can see the rivers. Dutch settled along the rivers, just like the Native Americans. Another classic Dutch building, Dutch roof, made out of stone. Dutch like to build out of stone and brick. The Martin Berry House, which goes back to 1663, which is a very old house in our area. This was a house owned by my great-great-grandfather in 1905. What it looks like today. So I wrote up a book about my Westervelt history. That's where a lot of this information came from. My mother was raised by her grandmother, Hattie Westervelt. I dedicated the book to them. The Romaine family, dedicated the book to those first Dutch settlers like we've been talking about. If you're interested in further information about what we've been talking about today, this is a very excellent book, The Island at the Center of the World. And it's the story of Dutch Manhattan and the forgotten colony, shaped America. Excellent, excellent book if you're looking for further reading. This is also an excellent book, The Colony of New Netherlands. Both of these books are readily available, you know, on Amazon. And it really is amazing when you think about it. From a tiny colony set up in 1626 at the point at the end of Manhattan that grew into the major city, the largest city in our country, a major city or major world city that we have today. All started from a little Dutch colony. I just want to mention one more thing about the settlement of the Hudson Valley. So we had the Dutch at Albany, you know, Fort Orange was the first settlement. And then in 1626, they established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. Well, they also decided that they needed an area of trade in between those. And that's why the settlement of Sophus was set up. Sophus Creek runs into the Hudson. Dutch established a factory there, a trading post. And unfortunately, they also went through a series of wars with the Native Americans. And in 1664, right before the Dutch were conquered by the British, there were three major Sophist wars. The Native Americans around Kingston and west of Kingston rose up and attacked the Dutch at Kingston. And 1664, of course, is when the Dutch were conquered by the British. So right after the Sophist wars were settled, that's when a Sophist was changed the name was changed to Kingston. And it was really under the British that a lot of the settlement west of Kingston took place. People came to Kingston and then spread out west of Kingston from at that time. So a lot of that settlement took place under the English, even though they were Dutch people. You know, they had sworn allegiance to the King of England and were English citizens and moved west. Okay, so thank you very much.